I'm really pleased to be here. Though a bit wary about giving a talk like this, given the last year of my life hasn't exactly been jam-packed with research and writing of the kind generally seen as ideal in the context of an academic life. I haven't been doing any of that stuff that Lynn talked about for quite a while. And in fact, anything resembling research that I have managed to get on with during the last year has been focused around making sense of events in my own life in my 42nd year. And it's actually something of this process and these changes that I want to talk about today. How's the volume? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay, good. So I'm going to draw on my experience of a couple of fairly common health conditions to try and think about the conceptualisation and embodiment of risk, and to a greater extent, trust. In particular, I want to question what it means and what it feels like to trust, and in what ways, for example, why and where and by whom those feelings of trust might be built upon or broken to produce a crisis of trust in oneself and or one's healthcare providers. I'll look at the kind of selves that are produced and performed as a result of such processes, and the associated emotions and feelings as in bodily sensations, that may or may not constitute trustworthy sources of knowledge about our health and well-being. So how do our own perceptions hold up when they're pitched against alternative informants, especially medical professionals aided by imaging and other technological sources of insight? Contemporary medical practice actually tends to diagnose and display health information in ways that digitise bodies, and this, I think, has potentially significant consequences for emotional life, especially if we ourselves look to and even perhaps come to rely on such measures of our own health and our own worth. I think the two concepts are often quite closely associated. And in this paper, I worry about the implications of these connections and developments for selves as forever fragile accomplishments. I want to suggest that increasing clinical tendencies to rely on data and to trust the numbers over the nuances of our own insight have disturbingly logical extension in a quantified self-movement that views selves simply as data-emitting machines. In discussing my concerns, I'll be thinking through boundaries of various kinds, including those frequently placed between physical and emotional sources of trauma and between visible and invisible health challenges and indicators. The distinctions between what can be seen and what can be felt can have profound implications for experience and treatment, both clinically and culturally, and in my own case can highlight discrepancies between the theory and the practice of emotional life. Although I have used autobiographical methods a lot in the past to think about other people's emotional lives, I've never drawn explicitly in my own experience in anything I've written before. And I'm not quite sure how I got here, but anyways, I hope that some of the insights that emerge over the next 45 minutes or so will have broader relevance for at least some of those here working on emotional geographies, professionally as well as personally. In attempts to write about what's happened over the last year, I've come to think about some of the significant moments in terms of event horizons, as involvements with something so massive that no aspect of the life that surrounds the encounter can possibly escape its pull. The first point of no return came in the form of concussion, and it's a fairly pedestrian story. I wasn't engaging in any high-risk activity, any high-risk behaviour at the time. I just slipped and I lost consciousness when I was standing beside my car. It was just me and my daughter. It was January in Ontario, so minus 20 odd with wind chill, and we live well out of town at a distance from potentially helpful neighbours. So I was out cold, pardon the pun, for I don't know how long, and came round to awareness of the world with my 4-year-old beside me asking, "Why won't you get up?" I spent a lot more time than was healthy over the months of recovery that followed, wondering what would have happened to her if I hadn't been able to get myself up off the ground. But in that moment, I thought I was okay, I thought I was fine, I thought I'd had a lucky escape, and wasn't even aware that I had lost consciousness, because however trustworthy we believe our senses to be, it turns out that they're actually not all that informative about an absence of input. To know you've been gone, you need to be able to recognise some change in your environment, something different in your surroundings that would indicate the passage of time, or perhaps a testimony from an observer, and preferably one who's more than 4 years old. Although I knew that I had hit my head, and that I had hit my head hard because it hurt like hell, and there was sound and lights of a kind that I had never experienced before, I didn't recognise this as a sign that I had lost touch with the world, and it was only later that others' questions actually brought the discontinuity to light between my daughters playing in a mound of snow immediately before I went down, and then being right by my side what seemed to me like a split second later. When I picked myself up off the ground, I felt a bit thrown, but I couldn't really see a problem with driving in for my intro geography lecture. I called a friend for reassurance, just to double check that I wasn't about to do anything crazy. According to her, clearly I was, and she was fairly persuasive about the need to get back into the house and cancel the lecture. My partner came home and he took me to the hospital, which I thought was probably a waste of time, and it felt like the doctor that I saw thought so too. The examination was very brief. He checked for lumps and signs of bleeding, and he did a few quick tests of cognitive function and eye movement before saying that I was fine, but I should probably take the rest of the day off just in case. And he said it might not be a bad idea to avoid watching television or reading books over the weekend. This happened on a Friday, but he said it'd be good to go back to work as usual on a Monday. I'm hearing a wee bit of feedback. Can you hear that at the back? Should I be further away from the mic? Does this sound okay? Thanks. So he said I'd be fine on Monday, and this seemed completely reasonable to me because I felt okay, though maybe a wee bit detached. I remember being only mildly concerned when I found myself standing right behind a car that was obviously about to reverse out of the hospital car park. I was holding my daughter's hand at the time, and although I'd seen the driver get into the car, and there was only one direction for him to go, there wasn't any other way out, it didn't actually occur to me that we should move out of his way. I didn't feel any danger, and even then didn't even experience any feeling of alarm about the signs that I had failed to interpret. But I did kind of know intellectually that enough here was out of the ordinary in terms of how I was thinking and how I was feeling to suggest to my partner that maybe he should keep an extra eye on our daughter. I did rest up for a couple of days, felt like a bit of a slacker, so went back to work on Monday as recommended. The headaches were pretty bad, but just about manageable with over-the-counter pain meds. And although I knew I was more tired than usual, I thought I would just go to bed a bit earlier, and then earlier and earlier and earlier. And for the next few weeks, I was aware that things were getting worse, quite a lot worse rather than better. And I was really feeling quite overwhelmed. Eventually doing very little beyond teaching my classes and going home to sleep until I had to get up and do the next one. I was having increasingly severe headaches too, along with bone-crushing fatigue, and it was becoming unavoidably obvious that I had seriously reduced cognitive capacity, which was a bit scary, to say the least. I started reducing the time that I spent in front of the computer because it hurt, and I kept cutting back until I couldn't do 5 minutes worth of email without having to shut the curtains and crawl back into bed. I was even struggling with hard copy readings for my grad class at this stage, and I had to start letting people know that I wasn't coping and trying to come up with strategies to get me through the rest of the term. I asked my doctor for a note at this point to legitimise a request for help, mostly with the online aspects of a course that had 350 students. And accommodations were never formalised, but I did look for support in other ways, doing things like arranging guest lectures and asking for extra time for journal reviews and so on. I used the phone rather than email whenever possible, and I got used to explaining to people that I wasn't feeling great and that I might have to leave meetings early, and then letting colleagues know that I might have to avoid eye contact in meetings and eventually keep my eyes closed completely because I couldn't deal with the sensory input. I'd started having bouts of vertigo too, and all of my social and spatial interactions were seriously messed up. The first doctor that I saw after the initial hospital visit was sympathetic, but there was obviously nothing to see, so there was no offer of insight or any kind of follow-up. I did go looking for help again, seeing different docs, sometimes in walk-in clinics when I was feeling a bit desperate, and what was on offer was stronger painkillers. During one appointment, I was told that I really should have recovered by now, and the fact that I hadn't suggested that I must have suffered another concussion in the past. And I suppose this was possible, something that hadn't been noted when I was a child. But I didn't really think so, and it all contributed to the sense that I wasn't doing recovery quite right. And in fact, I kept getting it very, very wrong, staying in bed for a couple of days and thinking, this time I'm all better, finally, only to find myself back where I started, or worse, sometimes within minutes of beginning the performance of normality. I made it through 2.5 months in this way, with a daily dismantling of trust in my judgment about my ability to do or be anything, because there was less and less of the social and spatial self-making stuff that I was used to going on every day. And on the last day of the teaching term, I pretty much collapsed, finally getting a referral for a concussion specialist who ordered immediate, complete and indefinite medical leave along with an MRI scan. Now, this was the first and it was the only attempt to get beneath the surface to try and see and measure the extent of this invisible disability, and I actually really welcomed the intrusion. I was told, though, that concussion diagnoses were controversial, scans were typically clear or inconclusive, and I was told when they didn't show anything, it meant that damage to the brain wasn't visible, not that it wasn't there, and even where trauma was apparent, it wasn't clear what it meant, so it seemed that therapeutic intervention was highly unlikely, and I guess I'd hoped for more. From my admittedly sketchy sense of the theoretical landscape, I'd been taken to understand that we live in a neurological age, one populated by synaptic or neurochemical cells, and visualising the brain and bringing its secrets to light has long seemed the next big thing. Neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio and Joseph Ledoux very publicly claim authority to solve brain mysteries of both a physical and emotional nature. And more popular media accounts also blur Cartesian lines between the material and mental trauma, and I've been aware of local reports about the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre's acquisition of an MRI that was dubbed in the press a mental health scanner, for its alleged ability to diagnose mental illness objectively and then track whether and how drug therapies were working. Sociologist Marit Soljar writes of medical imaging that as a culture we place a great deal of trust in visual modes of representation seen as instruments of truth and objectivity. And although explicitly aligned with more critical approaches like the neurosociology of Nicholas Rose, I was obviously not immune to such scientific attractions. Apparently, it was the forbidden theoretical fruit that I craved, a kind of redefinition through supposedly objective confirmation of my injury. Of course, the scan revealed nothing, but I did obtain something valuable from the process in the form of professional permission to do what I should have been doing from day one, i.e. nothing at all. And while the scope of my involvement with the world had been shrinking for some time, it was now an absolute minimum. I only went out of the house for the couple of concussion clinic appointments that were offered. I had no email and minimal phone contact with anyone, and I withdrew from all work commitments initially for the next month, spending my days travelling between my bed and a warm bath. And these were filled with endless cups of herbal tea and very, very little else. There was no books, no DVDs, no running, no alcohol, and there was nothing but staring out of the window for hours at a time, feeling still and solid, watching the green mist of spring spread through the garden, but too depleted to go out and take part. and then I got pregnant. So it's the month of May 2014. I'm still 42, but apart from the concussion, I'm healthy and I'm happy about the pregnancy. Unlike the concussion, this was familiar territory, and I felt like I could trust my body to know what it was doing. The docs that I saw for this condition, though, were predictably much more involved and in fact thoroughly interventionist from day one when an ultrasound was ordered, ostensibly to establish a due date. I didn't really think this was necessary. I could feel that I was pregnant in so many ways, and I really wasn't looking for more objective confirmation, but I went along because it was offered. I guess I welcomed the attention, at least in the beginning, and I think I was curious too. On the day, just a minute or so into the process, the image looked a bit like this one, and the sonographer pointed out the presence of not one, but 2 embryos. And to call it a surprise doesn't begin to cover it. But I still found myself happy, completely bewildered, but happy, even when the imaging technician stressed that twin pregnancy would involve at least twice the amount of medical appointments, twice the amount of tests, twice the amount of scans, and carried at least twice the risk of complications, risks that were not exactly negligible given my age. And I did eventually ask him to just stop talking, but he was mostly helpful. He was trying to be informative. And so at only 6 weeks, with embryos the size of lentils, my pregnancy was labelled high risk. No travel insurance for starters. And from that point on, my care was to be handled not by family doctor, not by midwife, but by high-risk obstetrician gynaecologist during bi-weekly and then weekly hospital appointments that took a couple of hours out of my day. I also had separate appointments for weekly tests to measure the free copper in my bloodstream because of one doc's new research obsession, and the constantly fluctuating results were used to calculate the amount of zinc that I should take on a daily basis, to neutralise, to zap the copper that apparently put my pregnancy at exceptionally high risk. Ultrasounds were frequent too and could last up to 90 minutes a time. And although I did welcome some of the associated testing, I wasn't convinced that the amount of imaging was strictly necessary. And I do know that I sound a bit fickle here, given my stance on concussion care, but it just seemed that everyone wanted to see so much more of this precious cargo than the one in my head, and it began to feel more like surveillance than care. It seemed, though, that I was expected to enjoy all the increased attention, and sonographers invariably assumed that I would want lots of pictures and to see the babies as often, for as long, and in as much detail as possible. But of course, with ultrasound, you're not actually seeing anything except a representation reconstructed from sound waves. And I usually wanted to process over as quickly as possible. More than once, though, I felt dismissed and maybe even ridiculed for my sense, and quite a strong sense, that the babies didn't actually like this noisy intrusion into their personal space. These concerns were judged completely unreasonable because there was no supporting evidence, right? No supporting evidence of this at all. And sonographers insisted that the fetuses were entirely oblivious, that they were completely insensible to any changes in their environment. To suggest that they cared or had anything approaching an emotional life was surely laughable. Maybe they were right, how would I know? But it was this kind of self-doubt, this kind of questioning of my authority and my ability to trust my feelings about what was going on that became increasingly familiar during the regular and often more serious challenges. Challenges to my trust in and knowledge about my pregnant self. Mostly, the friction emerged around numbers that were generated by these and other tests that were always held up as more reliable, more trustworthy, more objective, and altogether better sources of knowledge than anything that my tech-free sensing self could possibly produce. Of course, there has to be some truth in that, despite the most powerful critiques of scientific knowledge production at our disposal. But it wasn't always clear in what sense, or even if, the data generated could be contextualised or made meaningful. Data were often assumed to be valuable simply in virtue of their existence, or even their potential existence, as if it has to be collected because it's there. You know, we have the technology, we can do this, so we have to do it. And I think it's fair to say that how I felt was considered largely irrelevant as a source of even corroborative data. With each hospital visit, it seemed more and more as though the only thing that mattered was what they could measure. This included regular estimates of fetal weight, where data were plotted on growth curves used to establish whether I would be, quote, allowed to go full term, considered 36 weeks rather than 40 weeks in twin pregnancy, or whether the team would, quote, throw in the towel at an earlier date and go in and get them. That's a quote too. The language used during appointments really was extraordinary and incredibly paternalistic, and it never felt easy to question practitioners who were rarely equivocal in their opinions and advice, in fact often dishing it up like horror stories. And the situation became increasingly difficult given I often didn't entirely trust what I was being told, and for what I saw as good reason as well as gut feeling. Fetal weight estimates are actually notoriously unreliable, and there were many instances where communication about these and lots of other data actually seemed meant to induce fear, actually intended to scare me into compliant submission. For example, I was repeatedly told that there was a very high risk of delivery by caesarean section for twins. And we know this is true, but what was stressed was that I wouldn't be able to stand the pain if they had to go in and get them, i.e. manual extraction up to the elbow, and they always stressed this up to the elbow thing. That was always there front and centre in discussion, and this was why I, quote, needed to have an epidural, and why they, quote, always gave epidurals to women with multiple pregnancies. Now, because I wanted some basis in which to make a judgment about this and about whether it might be possible to remain mobile or even give birth in a position other than the gravity-defying flat-backed one some of the docs insisted was the only option, I actually asked the doctors in different ways and at different times for numbers what percentage of women declined the epidural, and of those, how many actually required caesarean section. Here, remarkably, it seemed there were no numbers. There was no research data that they were able or willing to share. But in terms of this particular hospital where the appointments were taking place, I was told none. I found this unbelievable, literally, and pressed for more detail after managing to actually find someone who had done the allegedly impossible in the self-same building. Now, what I heard then, in contrast to the earlier insistence and precision, was, well, yeah, there's been a handful of women, but they'd all had 5 or 6 kids before, and the babies practically fell out by themselves. Practitioners worked hard here to discount alternative evidence and agency other than their own. They couldn't have portrayed those actively resistant women more passively if they'd tried. Thus did the climate of fear intensify. And although I really did feel at risk at this point, it wasn't quite in the clinical sense that the docs intended. The hospital itself began to feel like a very unsafe place to be. This sense of mistrust was compounded by the handling of a glucose tolerance test, when my ability to process 75 grams of sugar within 1 hour measured 1 measly point above the range of normal. I was suddenly and definitively declared diabetic and thrown into a whole other set of clinic appointments, which turned out to be among the most infantilising experiences of my adult life. Along with a blood sugar testing kit, I was given nutritional fact sheets to make sure that I knew the difference between an apple and a Mars bar. Maybe that was because I was Scottish, I don't know, it is possible. And and I was given my very own journal to record readings to be taken half an hour after every meal with explanations. I was told to write my excuses, explanations for any high numbers in the margins. And this book was to be taken to and reviewed at each appointment with the not so veiled threat of further intervention if the numbers weren't good. I wasn't supposed to take any bad numbers. Even though evidence of improved outcomes is very far from conclusive with this kind of diet-controlled gestational diabetes. Although I didn't trust the diagnosis, not least because proper testing protocol had been rushed, they wouldn't test again, and the label stayed with me for the duration, with all of the associated risk of cascading interventions, because one test almost always leads to another and another and another, and that quest for absolute certainty and absolute control. But I couldn't help wanting to be a good patient and pass all of these tests was absolutely maddening. And although I know that a lot of what I'm saying here must sound like utter ingratitude in the face of such intensive and obviously costly care, I did often feel obliged, and of course I wanted the best care for my babies. What this amounted to, though, was a feeling of constant tension, an emotional dissonance that became a kind of keynote of the pregnancy, and often my feelings of appreciation really conflicted with a longing to be left alone because I didn't feel that there was anything wrong with me. What I did feel was considerable stress, frequent awareness of breaking a number of feeling rules guiding doctor-patient interactions, and the constant strain of keeping inappropriate emotional responses under wraps. I didn't feel wise, for example, to voice questions or complaints that might reveal my profound sense that the doctors didn't always know best. And because I wasn't expected to want to know why, I had to make decisions about compliance on the basis of trust without access to key information. With blood copper treatment, this actually put my pregnancy at greater risk. Weekly tests used to calibrate my zinc intake called for the precise spacing of tablets 6 times a day, 2 hours after food and 1 hour before food, at which point you want to say, have you ever met a pregnant woman? We're rarely 3 hours away from food 1 time a day, never mind 6 times a day. So this felt like a completely impossible demand. But no one actually explained that ingesting zinc without an empty stomach flushes copper out of the tissues and into the bloodstream, where it poses a much higher risk to the pregnancy. When I found this out, it didn't even feel possible to negotiate a more manageable treatment schedule because practitioners weren't dealing with me anymore, but with my numbers, with what digital sociologists have termed my data double. Now, I knew that I wasn't supposed to feel quite so offended by the numbers that seemed to be ruling my life at this point, and I also knew excuse me, that some people actually want to be quantified in these ways, that some people feel reassured, perhaps even empowered, rather than reduced or disciplined by the process. And I think it would be hard to avoid the cultural trend that's known as the cultural trend of life logging that's known as a quantified self movement, knowledge, motto, self-knowledge through numbers. And the growing academic, as well as popular literature around this, details the unimaginably many measurable aspects of our lives. Most contemporary quantified selfers would no doubt consider my biometric data collection strategies to be decidedly old school. My numbers were generated by ultrasound, glucose monitors and blood tests rather than wearable sensors and computers. But sociologist of emotion, Deborah Lupton, argues that there are clear connections between these various approaches to measuring, monitoring and visualising the body. Current practice continues the attempt to make a spectacle of ourselves, and quantification taken to today's extreme can perhaps provide insights into more quotidian clinical practice. It might help us understand some of the motivations for and some of the implications of treating ourselves in this way as data emitting machines. For enthusiasts like movement founder Gary Wolfe, there are many motivating factors for self-tracking that don't involve clinical coercion, and often these relate to the achievement of desirable change. For Wolfe, tracking provides a trustworthy evidence base on which to make decisions about how to change our behaviour and our bodies, because it replaces intuition with something much more reliable, i.e. data that provide greater insight into diet, exercise, sleep, and just about every other activity that you could think of. Some quantified selfers do describe tracking emotions or moods using apps that enable them to account for how they feel more accurately. One is quoted in a recent paper as saying, "I can look down at my phone at any point in the day and see kind of how stressed I am." However, Lupton's work suggests that emotion often has a different part to play, that it can be product rather than focus of the process. And what that means, she's writing that emotions, that tracking can often stimulate useful emotions such as fear or guilt or shame that might motivate beneficial change. She doesn't actually mention anxiety here, which, as I'm sure you've got, is my own primary response to quantification, and I don't need an app to tell me this. But I know that my experience isn't typical of those who track less reluctantly and often less narrowly around health. Such calculated attempts to enhance well-being are often more about self-improvement than health improvement, with claims about self-optimisation or self-actualisation being common, and about how to become, and I cringe as I say this, your best self. What this suggests, among other things, is a widespread recognition of insights found in feminist and other post-structural theory that selves are inherently relational, and that technological interactions are indeed productive of different and quite particular kinds of subjectivities. There's a lot going on in such high-tech productions, and Deborah Lupton has written that self-tracking represents the apotheosis of self-reflexivity. I don't think that it does, and I would suggest that tracking involves more self-inspection than self-reflection, and that it's more about instrumental appraisal than anything productive of genuinely meaningful self-understanding. Reflecting on the nature of selfhood, Gary Wolfe writes that we tend to think of our physical selves as a system that is too complex to understand. But what we've learnt from companies like Google is that if you can collect enough data, there's no need for a grand theory to explain a phenomenon. You can observe it all through the numbers. There's an interesting slippage here, I think, between observation and explanation, between information and meaning, in which everything worth knowing is presumed to leave self-evident physical traces. The information collected by quantified selfers is geared strongly towards enhancing predictability and enabling manipulation and fostering at least the illusion of control. It seems, then, to be more concerned with self-governance and self-knowledge through numbers, as Costea and colleagues suggest, and so does indeed represent a clear and worryingly logical extension of the long-term twin projects of technologisation and medicalisation, which, as many feminist scholars have pointed out, play central roles in the marginalisation of women's self-narratives by medical men and their expensive machines. And I might actually give us a short break for some illustrative comic relief here and take us to the Python's fetus frightening room. And it's not here. Just bear with me. Okay, so it's just going to take a second. Okay, we're good. We're good. Now it's going back to the beginning. Okay, I should be able to get it.
It's not showing from the screen.
Okay, so how do we get up to the point?
Okay, it should be if you close the coming back into close this one there. Oh, I don't know what that's doing with your laptop. Maybe close it down.
Close this one down completely?
Close it down. And then if you press play on that, it should be.
No?
It's not showing up on your.
Why is this not coming up?
I'm sure it must be set to begin to hear that. It's not showing up on your desktop. I'm not sure why it's not. It must be settings on your computer. It's not coming up on the screen. I'm not sure if I'll get the picture up on food.
It's annoying.
Yeah. What's the total on yours? Is that 5, yeah?
I don't know.
Okay, I don't know if I get the picture up. Do you want to play the audio or?
We could try and see what it's like.
Okay, I'll turn the volume up on my.
Is it volume?
Yeah, I can turn it up.
Okay, so now the PowerPoint's not coming back up. So obviously this all worked perfectly before you arrived. Can you see how I don't like technology? Yeah. So I'd imagine quite a lot of people here have seen that Monty Python clip, The Miracle of Birth from the Meaning of Life, yeah? Can you give me a sense of... It's quite, yeah. It's interesting that it's 32 years old, but I think it still has quite a lot of resonance today. There's a woman in this room with all these expensive machines that go ping. There are many more men than women, so the gender dynamic is quite familiar. They are ignoring the patient completely. At one point, the loser, they think there's something missing in this room. I've got all those machines, things look good, but there's something missing. What's missing? The patient, they say. And somebody drags her out from behind a cupboard. And she's lying there saying, "What should I do? What should I do?" And the Don Clee's main doctor says, "Nothing, dear, you're not qualified." So she lies back again with her legs in the air. And when they deliver the baby, they say we have to frighten it. So they've got a meat cleaver to chop the umbilical cords. And they say, frighten it, so they wobble it in the air, and then isolate it as they put it in an isolation chamber. And then everybody leaves the room, and she's told that she might suffer some completely irrational feelings of depression for some time. But here's a pill, and she's told to go away and go on with it. So there's a lot about it, that still has resonance. And I thought about this clip when I was showing the fetus frightening room, the twin birthing room in the hospital where I was to give birth, and told that there would be 14 medical people present in the room when I gave birth. And I wasn't laughing then, I tell you. Didn't think that was funny in the slightest. And yeah, it was going to be a lot like this. There was going to be a lot of people, a lot of machines. And I had the strong sense too that where emotions were to be included as part of the technological picture, that it would be a lot like this, right? That they're mentioned at the end only to be quickly dismissed. And I think that's often the way it happens. Emotions are there to be dismissed, or, as in Lupton's account, to be put to particular and worrying use. By which I mean that they're given space merely in terms of use value, that they are framed by an instrumental rationality that's incapable of seeing emotionality as valuable on its own terms or in any other terms. For fully reflexive emotional selves, it surely doesn't feel good to be produced and reduced in this way to something one-dimensional. As I've argued before, emotions are wild, untamable by language or code, and any static representation that can't make space for that wildness and that sees emotional selves as matters for management isn't worth the paper or the programme that it's written on. So how did we get here to a point where the quantification project has been downloaded onto a willing and relentlessly self-reporting laity? Why so many of us would choose to technologise ourselves in this way is a genuine mystery. It's like some kind of post-humanist nightmare of self-objectification. But Heidegger warned many moons ago that the technological framework is inherently expansionist and can reveal only by reduction. It involves an attempt to enclose all beings in a particular claim, utter availability and sheer manipulability. Technology here represents a threat to human spirit that he calls Gestell, or in translation, enframing. Although Heidegger does not privilege the visual, the term, I think, is evocative of high-tech society's ocular centrism, where even invisible interiors, including landscapes of the unborn, are rendered otherwise frameable by ultrasound imaging. Some have characterised this visualising imperative in terms of a cultural shift from the haptic to the optic, and it seems we're quite literally losing touch with what matters in ways that have significant implications for the production and performance of trustful relations. To quote Lupton again, as one's bodily states and functions become ever more recordable and visualised via data displays, it becomes easier to trust the numbers over physical sensations. But what does this even mean? That it's possible to trust numbers more than ourselves? What is trust, and how and where exactly does it take place? A great deal has been written about trust in the context of healthcare in recent years, and while some scholars attempt to measure trust in medical expertise or expert systems, others concur that it's messy, mysterious, and hardly quantifiable. Trust theorist Guido Mollering writes that trust is idiosyncratic, and that the leaps of faith that enable trust are ultimately to be understood as emotional commitments and accomplishments. Trust, then, is an emotional skill, writes philosopher Robert Solomon, and trustful relations involve this leap of faith precisely because they are rarely based on or reducible to entirely logical processes. Writing in a broader sociological context, Anthony Giddens claims that the faith which trust implies tends to resist such calculated decision-making. And further, that trust presumes the opening out of the individual to the other. This opening out leaves us exposed in various senses, and we take risks when we trust. We reposition ourselves as vulnerable by investing another with a degree of power over ourselves, and although it's often necessary to do so to facilitate the smooth running of everyday life, when the stakes are higher, we take particular care not to misplace trust. We also reevaluate these placings and our positionings on an ongoing basis, reflecting on the routine performances and the effective competencies that can make or break trust in a heartbeat. More often though, trustful relations take time to change and people themselves are transformed in the process. That's to say, trust and its absences are also productive of different subjectivities that are intimately involved in the composition and decomposition of emotional selves. How, then, do we respond and reform in relation to quantification? I would suggest that whereas typical trustful relations work to strengthen our sense of connection with other people and our feeling of rightness in place, trust in numbers functions largely to isolate us effectively from birth. Arithmetical trust subtracts us from potentially meaningful contexts and relations other than perhaps competitive ones where we think about and evaluate how we measure up against others. And I think such metrics are masculinising in that they fail to account for intersubjectivities, emotional relations and mutual reliances. They operate in virtue of and intensify the illusion that selves operate atomistically as singular self-governing systems. In effect, the only context that matters becomes internal, and the process inspires further self-absorption by replacing another figure, number one, at its core. Heidegger writes that, and he refers to this single-mindedness as an inevitable consequence of inframing by technology a delusional state where man everywhere and always encounters only himself. Taken to an extreme then, and I think self-quantifying practice is often pretty extreme, though now also often utterly commonplace, trust in numbers makes selves that are worth less in the relational context that count, or that should count as valuable in emotionally healthy lives. In medical theory and practice, the turn towards quantification has had similarly enervating effects, involving the outsourcing of self-awareness to external indicators, and so promoting detachment in various senses, none of which are healthy. To try and illustrate this, I've used two examples of healthcare where trust in medical professionals, their workplaces and technologies, and in myself, was complex and changing in ways powerfully impacted by numbers. With concussion, however, at least initially, there were no tests of numbers beyond counting backwards from 107s and how many fingers am I holding up. The MRI happened much later, but even then, attempts to see the problem were all so much less authoritative, despite a culture of quantification and popularised neuroscience that left me, the malcontent, craving recognition in the form of objective assessment. I'd reached a crisis of trust in subjective evaluation, and so it seemed bizarre that diagnosis and treatment of head trauma could involve taking the patient at their word. The practice requires trust in self-reporting at a time when the self is profoundly debilitated by the absence of perceptual intervolvement with other selves and spaces, that essential self-making stuff of everyday life. For me then, a qualified rather than quantified self was the result of concussion and its mistrustful relations. And I mean something akin to a qualified success here, a not quite or partial self, one relatively ill-formed and infirm. I'm not entirely convinced that the concussion is a thing of the past either. I sometimes wonder if the term post-concussion is as nonsensical as the term post-feminism. But pregnancy tends to have a more predictable and decisive conclusion, if we're lucky, and I was. I want to return to the close of that story now. I'd got to the point where, with every hospital appointment and data collection session, my stress was up and my confidence was down, and you could have graphed that, I'm sure. And much of the time in between was spent in attempts to try and reverse these trends through my own research aimed at identifying and having conversations with mothers and midwives in other parts of the world with more positive experiences of twin pregnancy and birth. With hindsight, I think I was seeking space that was restorative rather than risky, and fostering interactions with others who'd experienced what they termed natural birth without trauma. Towards the end of my pregnancy, it felt like a lack of faith in the numbers that prompted these relations almost gave me something constructive to butt up against. An emotional stance of resistance in itself enabled alternatives, other framings that perhaps strengthened a sense of self that was obviously ill-served by metric configurations. In stark contrast then to the untethered self-light of concussion, I was grounded and growing as a heavily pregnant, intensely emotional and expansive embodied self, one that felt in the end worth trusting. Being 42 offered precious few answers to the ultimate questions of life, the universe and everything, whatever Douglas Adams had to say about it. But it was starting to feel like a pretty good number to be. When I was 30 weeks pregnant, cramps from a stomach flu showed up on a fetal monitor as contractions 2 minutes apart, requiring hospitalisation, despite my suggestions I wasn't actually in labour because I thought I would know. 2 weeks later, when I knew I had entered active labour, I managed to keep the monitors off me for the most part by staying as mobile as possible until my twin babies were ready to be born a few hours later. I found myself finally able to trust my feelings about what my body and what the babies could do, and I was able to claim space to labour in hope for the best rather than in fear for the worst. As I said, I was lucky and the babies were healthy. They stayed in neonatal intensive care for a month though, for fattening up and of course monitoring by machines that measured oxygen saturation, heart and respiration rates. And while they were there, I developed an absolutely infuriating tendency to watch the machines rather than watch the babies when I was in the room with them. It was really very crazy making. But what I'd learned from the nurses, I learned something about trusting judgments in context from watching what they were doing, which was really interesting because their care was very definitely not reliant on the numbers, on the readings from the machines. Often alarms would simply be switched off. They would always come quickly, they would come from the other side of the room, but they might switch the alarm off immediately because a nurse's glance or touch judged colour or tone to be healthy, despite the flashing lights and the plummeting figures on the machines that go ping. Of course, with twins, there's always the temptation to conduct scientific experiments. And there are fantastical resources for the quantified baby at home. I could conduct the exact same monitoring with sensor-embedded baby clothing and transmit data to my phone, and I could use Nap Tracker and other apps to record and compare feeding times and nappy content and moods and export all of this data into spreadsheets that would make baby care into some kind of experimental data management. Or maybe it's time to move on by letting go of my hold on the numbers and even of their hold on me. Thank you.
Time for questions and contributions for the floor. So you're short, and I'd like as many people to get a chance to say or ask whatever they would like as possible. So, and perhaps people could just say their name when they speak, just so that we probably have got to know each other over the last 2 days, but just in case not. Can start again now. After such a fantastic, engaging contribution, sometimes we're stunned with silence, but I'm hoping this isn't going to last long. Yes, please. So we have some roving mics, so someone's coming to you. So if you could just say your name, please.
Thank you, Joyce. That was an amazing talk. Thank you for using all your own life story in a talk like this, because it's not easy to do so, so thank you for doing that. There's so many questions that you could ask. It just occurred to me as I was listening that the technologies that you're talking about appear to be producing a different kind of value for, of the lives at stake, i.e. the story of the technologies used for the babies is maybe more about their future life and their protection, and therefore all the technology is kind of you're assailed with it, partly because of the value of their future life. And the technology is producing a kind of a value that's ascribed to the vital life inside, compared to the lack of technological intervention for the concussion, in which your present, your life, your vital life, is perhaps not ascribed as much value because of the lack of intervention and the lack of technologies that were available to you. And that may be something about how the technologies are involved in producing value and ascribing that to different kinds of life at different ages, but it also may be about the technologies themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling on.
Joyce, do you want to take several questions, or do you want to go straight into that one?
I'll maybe try and respond to that, because I think it is really interesting, and I think I was really aware from the first time, when that first ultrasound was ordered, that I knew it wasn't about me. I mean, we know that when we're pregnant, right? It's about the precious cargo that you're carrying, and that it is about their protection and very much about trying to ensure some future security. And we're on board with so much of that, like we're so absolutely committed to, what I said, providing the best care, but also very aware about how those lives were being constructed in a way that was separate from me. Like, I think every one of those uses of technology is a way of almost, imposing some kind of separation, some isolation between mother and child to be, because your responsibility is mediated through technology, and your role is, and so many feminists have said this. There's been so much interest in feminist work in pregnancy, obviously, that talks about how women can be sidelined because you're just the carrier, right? It's the baby that matters. It's the and trying to, if you think those relations, if we take these ideas that we have about intersubjectivities and relational selves seriously, and I think everybody here does, then why aren't we thinking about how those are established at the earliest possible date in the womb, and the kind of emotional relations, right? The ways that these are mediated between mother and fetuses, and taking seriously the ways that technologies can flatten and disturb those potentially rich emotional relations, or that delay them happening. I guess I think a lot of women experience a delay in their ability to connect in ways that aren't mediated by technology. Although it's complicated, because people do talk about being able to bond better with their babies, having seen an ultrasound image, having seen the photograph. I mean, I didn't experience that, and I think we always have to take care not to try and extrapolate from our own experience and try and take seriously how other people view things. So maybe some people, because our culture is so heavily focused and prioritising the visual, there maybe is a sense in which emotional relations can be fostered by the production of those kind of images. And there was something else I was thinking about. I often wonder if the technologies that are available as well, we use what's available, but it seems, and what's least expensive in some ways as well, the kind of technologies that are developed. Anyway, I'm going to leave that point.
Okay, so please, yes, just trying to through that, please.
clear that you know, compared to technological knowledge, you value emotional knowledge.
Could you speak up a wee bit, please?
Yeah, that's funny. I wanted to say to you also that if you could speak up that way, it's hard to hear you. Okay, so I'm interested in asking you about the status of emotional knowledge. The way I was thinking.
Sorry, I can't.
Is the microphone working properly? Yeah? Yeah.
I did it. All right, okay. So I was interested in the status of emotional knowledge in your talk, and I would just love to hear you elaborate on that. That's basically what I'm asking. And one way of thinking about that as I was listening to you was, it's clear that you have an antipathy for the self-evidence of technological knowledge to emotional knowledge. But then, you know, in your discussion of the concussion, it was so much about how you became suspended in a state of indeterminacy. It wasn't really emotional knowledge, it was discovering what you couldn't do and trying to have a relation to that. And then the pregnancy, its own form of concussion, you know, even though you said emotions are wild, you still wanted the cultivation of emotional knowledge as a kind of anchor or ground against technological knowledge or something. Anyway, it just would be great, because I think one of the things that's hard is that the experience of emotion, I'm not even talking about affect, but the experience of emotion is often a destabilizing experience rather than an anchoring one. And
The experience of emotion is often destabilizing rather than anchoring.
yes,
Yeah.
or at the same time, right? So it's a disturbance. That's how you know you're having an event. So I would just love to hear that.
So you said something about the concussion earlier. So a point about the concussion and the absence of technology.
That when you describe your emotional state during concussion, it was a state of suspension, of non-knowledge, and of self-understanding by discovering what you couldn't do.
Yeah.
And it was over time, and it wasn't diagnosed. And it doesn't seem to me that emotional knowledge against technological knowledge was really at play there. It was all about disturbance, you know, and that the pregnancy, by being over-medicalized during pregnancy, you had resistant knowledge or something.
Yeah.
A resistant self-encounter. But again, I guess at that point in the talk you said emotional knowledge is wild, which suggested to me that it was also a disturbance. And then I thought, okay, I don't know what you think emotional knowledge is, and I would just love to hear more.
So I was saying that emotions are wild, that they're things that can't be tied down or represented easily by language. And the point I was making there was in relation to the quantified self movement that does attempt to pin down and exactly do that thing about representing, using language, or worse, by using code, right? By trying to come up with visuals that represent emotions, and that's not something that fits with my sense, the emotional experiences that I had as part of my pregnancy. Now, with concussion, the experience was baffling to me in so many ways, and it really was infuriating to be trying to find myself craving that kind of objective evaluation, right? And I know some of it was about wanting legitimation at work, because when you suffer from something that's invisible, it's really difficult to get that recognition, to get the support, to get the accommodations. So having something like that bit of paper that you could say, look, a professional said, you know, I really am experiencing this. It's not just me, it's not just how I feel. So to try and get some kind of objective evaluation was really annoying. But I don't think I had any source of knowledge about myself that was reliable at that point at all, emotional or otherwise, because I think the sense of self that I was entertaining on a daily basis was so debilitated, because I wasn't doing anything, you know, apart from the concussion. I wasn't taking part in those normal everyday interactions that make that sense of self in relation with others. So I did not, my feelings about the concussion, my experience of the concussion, I wouldn't talk about in terms of that emotional knowledge. It was an absence of all sorts of things. And I think the pregnancy was a coming back to awareness of what it felt like to experience my body in those terms, to learn to trust myself again, because I knew I couldn't trust that, right? I didn't want that technological definition, so it was something to actively redefine that sense of self against, and try and build that sense of trust up against it.
Okay, so there's another question over here.
Thanks, Jamie McLean. I just want to say that even though I'm male, I've resonated with you very much, because I had a baby, I didn't have a baby, the miracle of birth hasn't quite on that far yet, but my partner had a baby last year, and 4 hours after he was born, he went blue. By the way, this story doesn't, it does end okay. He went blue, and he had to be rushed to a hospital from where he'd been given birth in maternity ward. And it was quite a long way from Kendal to Lancaster in the ambulance, but he was put in a glass kind of unit, and I was very nervous because I thought he was going to die, and I asked him to hold his hand, and he said no. I said, okay, well, can I come with him? He said no. I said, okay. So I arranged with my partner, she could go with me in the ambulance, I couldn't, I wasn't allowed to.
Your partner could go in the ambulance?
Yeah, she could go, but she couldn't hold his hand. She wasn't allowed to hold his hand. They said no. So they rushed down in the ambulance to the hospital at Lancaster. And I had to drive down there to meet them. But that drive was the worst drive of my life. I cried all the way. And the only song I had in my head was that, I think it was the Killers, some song. He's got wires coming in, he's got wires, and now he's in the baby. And I bawled my eyes all the way, and I thought, when I turned up there, he's going to be dead. And I turned up, he wasn't. He was absolutely fine. And in fact, he was fine in the ambulance on the way down, my partner said. He just turned through, it was to do with just mucus, more than anything else at all. But as soon as we got to the hospital, the machines came out, just in case. And then we found he was tongue-tied as well, so we had to have that cut. They wouldn't allow us in the room with it to hold it if there was any problem with it, the tongue-tie being cut. So we were told to get out of the room. I said, well, I'd rather stay in the room. He said, well, you can't do it then.
But this wasn't during surgery, this was just the room that he was...
Just regular, routine, tongue-tie cut.
Right.
And it carried on, and it was a whole week's worth of that type of power play. And my question to you after that was, it was extremely emotional event, the whole week. But to me, it felt like it was linked intimately to power and power play. Within leaflets that we were given as well, telling us what we should do, that I then investigated a bit more into money and cost cutting.
Sorry, what do you mean there were the cost cutting?
Linked to what we should give him regarding injections and things like this, and what was best for him and so on. So we decided to go with our own decisions eventually. But the whole process was about, for me, was about power and how power links to emotion. Now I was just wondering if you felt any of that during your story, where power came into it, or power play, and whether you felt any inequity regarding that in any way whatsoever.
I felt that a lot, and one of the things that was interesting is the ways that I thought a lot of the practitioners were actually very emotionally skilled, that they used particular types of discourses and they would embody particular emotional stances, ways of communicating one thing while saying something completely different, right? And I almost felt as if it had been a part of their training in a way that was quite puzzling, because we know that emotions, people have written about this, that emotions don't tend to be included to the extent that some of us might like in medical training. But there was something about a performance of so trying to encourage trustful relations, that we know best, we're looking after you, we really care, And this is in a North American context, so there are cultural differences here too, but a way of acting like they really cared, right? Emotional connection, fostering all this stuff, when what they were saying, there was often a real sense of dissonance, right? A real lack of connection between the content, the words that were actually being spoken, and the attitude that they were trying to perform. And the words, it was always about power, and it felt as if the emotional performance was about backing up that power in ways that were manipulative and very uncomfortable. But yeah, power. It was all very often felt about power play in ways that I, sometimes wanted them to have that power, because they did have the expertise and the knowledge that were necessary to potentially save the baby's lives, right?
Right, so there's something down front here, and I can see another hand, and can people just indicate if they're still wishing to ask questions, because we're coming towards the end, and I want to try and make sure that everybody gets their shot.
Okay. Thanks very much. My name is Amanda Rees, and it struck me that the time that you were going through concussion, maybe weren't obviously listening and watching television in the United States, there was an explosion of discussion about concussion all around football, American football. And there were 2 or 3 major documentaries that came out at the time, lots of angst about young males at school, and then serious discussion about increasing the age when young males were going to begin to play sort of more contact, aggressive football. Lots of discussion about research around after death of brains, what brains were looking like, and then lots of talk about footballers donating their brains, lots of issues about suicide, early age suicide. It just struck me as if, if you'd been on a football field in, was it 2014, 2013, you could have had a very different experience.
Do you know, I don't actually think so, and it is a really interesting point. I mean, what happened in Canada, it's all around ice hockey, right? And there is a lot of talk about a concussion crisis, and there's a guy called Matt Ventresca at Queen's that's been trying to get some funding to do a research project, a social sciences research project on concussion, and he's actually struggled to get that funding. And I think it's interesting because all of that talk, from my experience, is about technologising the experience. It's about coming up with better helmets, right, to prevent concussions happening in the first place. And there's very, very little that's actually been done about concussion care. And the concussion specialist that I was referred to was actually somebody who was, most of his patients were young varsity, whatever the term is, they were all sports people, right? So I think I was quite unusual. And the care wasn't there. So there is this massive discussion of a concussion crisis, but I don't think the care is in place to deal with it at all.
Yeah, could you go up back there, please?
Hello, thank you. I'm Pam Smith. I wasn't going to ask you this, but since there was a comment about your baby, and I'm glad that was a happy ending, I just wanted to say about the emotions of health workers, some of the issues around the new target-driven healthcare. And in fact, in Canada, there's been a very important study using institutional ethnography to actually show that the new target-driven culture actually makes nurses in particular work against their intuitive judgments, particularly around discharge. And I was just thinking too that you were talking about risk. but also a lot of the protocols that have been introduced have been about risk and risk aversion or because of and prevention because of all the problems around suing, etc. And just one other point to make there is that health workers and their intuitive knowledge, these protocols stop them breaking the rules, their own intuitive rules, to make judgments about what was going on. So I just wanted to make that connection around target culture, but also about risk.
Yeah. And I'm not aware of that study, but I mean, it doesn't surprise me. And I think a lot of the nurses that were in the intensive care unit when I was there, when my babies were there, would talk about this kind of thing a lot, about the pressures, about the kind of things that they shouldn't do, that they knew they shouldn't do, they would get into trouble for doing, but they would still do it. And they were being turned into data managers in so many ways, including a whole new system for managing the production of breast milk, where babies were given a barcode, and any breast milk that was delivered could no longer be put in a bottle with a mother's name on it and a baby's name on it. It all had to be logged in a computer. It took so much time. It was unbelievable. Every time a woman came in with a bottle of breast milk, the nurse was pulled off the floor to be standing at a computer for a considerable amount of time when she wasn't there to look after the babies. And they were very angry about it. Nobody thought it was a good idea, but it was happening. There's no way that was going to be withdrawn because they had paid a fortune for the system to manage the milk.
Okay, I think there was somebody in the middle here.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I'm sure there's lots of this. I wanted to ask a question about the possibilities of perhaps connecting the two sides of your sort of discussion. I guess about the kind of the body self and losing our own kind of sense of how we might make sense of things, and this kind of very technologised data. I remember my own experience in terms of getting all that data in terms of a high-risk pregnancy. At one point asking, like, I don't think I need any more data, like you were suggesting. And saying, well, there's data here. You know, it was kind of, that's not a legitimate answer. Legitimate answer is there lots of data. But when I asked what do I do with this data, there wasn't an answer to it. And I think there's that sort of disconnect between the availability of the data and our ability as patients, actually sometimes as medical professionals, to know what to do with that data, because they can't actually answer the question that you want to ask that data, which is, well, how do I decide whether or not I should continue with this pregnancy? So I think that's one of the questions, is kind of disconnect between the availability of the data and the surface of data, and connecting what we do with that data. And something that's quite helpful when a medical professional can actually say, well, actually, yeah, I don't, like, you know, so your neurological answer is interesting, because the neurologists are very much a sense of people say, well, actually, we don't know. There's very much a sort of strong sense of saying you don't know stuff. So I thought that was quite an interesting connection. So I was thinking about that kind of context between what we do with information, how we connect the information with our ability to engage with that data, and when we have knowledge, when we don't have knowledge. And just to connect it to the other side of what we were talking about, the kind of this multitude of apps and things like that. I've become aware recently of an app that's been piloted for helping with diagnosing mental health problems. So the sort of anecdote about I look at my app to know that I'm stressed, which we kind of thought was ridiculous. But actually, mental health charities have this app to work with students where they can look at some of the risk factors for mental health, and they can actually look at themselves and and it would be a way of kind of recognising in themselves some factors that say, actually, the way I feel, it's legitimate to be worried, and actually I've ticked enough risk factors that this can encourage me to go and seek help. And initially I kind of was a bit unsure about that, and then talking to some of my students, including students who had mental health problems, it was clear that for them, that was actually quite a good idea. You could do it by yourself, and it gave the legitimacy to say, actually, well, I'm not just being stupid, actually I tick these sort of things. So it struck me that there was an example of something that is a kind of technologised, privatised, if you like, if you do it by yourself, response, where a generation that is much more used to kind of tracking things on apps, and that's where they would go for information. They actually got some sort of quantified reassurance, perhaps a bit like you were seeking with the concussion, that said, no, actually, you do have something, and the next thing you should do is go and get some help. So it's just sort of talk about context between information may be good if we're given the tools to know what to do with it. And often in the situation you talk about his pregnancy, there's just a surfeit of data, but actually nobody can really say, you know, this is what you should do with this data.
But with the app that you were talking about for your students, I can imagine that students of mine would find that valuable too, and it's certainly not something you could imagine ever discouraging anybody from using, because if there's any possibility of getting the help that you need for any mental health challenges, then you know, obviously that's desirable, but I think it raises bigger questions about our culture and our ways of managing relations and understanding ourselves. If there is this kind of outsourcing of our emotions, you know, our self-awareness to technology companies, and you know, I worry about a lot of what happens to this data, right? You know, and people are doing research on this now because it is uploaded. And is no longer the possession, it no longer belongs to you if you're using these kind of apps. So it's not protected by the kind of medical confidentiality clauses, right? It's not protected at all. You don't own it. Anyway, that's another issue. It's a huge issue. But the point I would want to make here is that there's something, and I would use the word sad, right, about needing this kind of technology rather than a conversation, rather than, you know, some kind of face-to-face interaction. And I know it's not clear-cut. You know, I've done research about the value of online support networks. I mean, that, you know, the technology has its place, but I think we need to be aware and wary in asking questions about broader cultural implications for the production and performance of emotional selves, right? What kind of selves is this likely to produce? What's it doing to us? You know, what are we doing to ourselves?
Okay, I've been pleased with one other small question. So we are now trespassing on your time, so please. Give your name.
My name is Sophie Thames. I was just thinking as you were talking about the triangular relationship to knowledge, right? This idea of outsourcing. And I have that aversion response that the machine is going to tell me how I feel, but similarly that kind of, you know, there's been instances where you really need that external affirmation, that confirmation to affirm your own sense of knowing. And the sort of implicit ideal that we should be self-authorizing, that I shouldn't need to have that external affirmation. And I wonder if it's not that it's the introduction of the machine as the new sort of third party, but that it's somehow connected to the way that we're no longer living in relationships where we're known, where, you know, we have mothers and grandmothers and neighbors who we've been around forever that have that kind of intimate knowledge of us, who would reflect back to us, oh, you're not yourself, or, oh, you know, that somehow the machine is standing in for rich networks of contextual relationships. And that we're, you know, we have them apt to tell us we're stressed because our mom isn't there, or our neighbor, or our friend, or our trusted other isn't there to say, what's up with you? Do you think that there's a machine displacing personal relationships here because of the distanced way that we're living?
I think, you know, perhaps to an extent I'm sure that is true, but there also is something about, how to put this, I mean, if you say things like people struggling with emotional literacy or something, I mean, that's not what I mean. That even the vocabulary is changing, that the way that we can legitimise our discussions about our emotions are changing, right? And I think technology has a part to play. You know, I would agree to an extent, but I think there's other stuff going on too, you know, which is a very non-answer. But